thank you all for joining. So we're co-hosting this with the National VBMA and National SAVMA. I would say I know we've got Tyler here from National VBMA. Thank you so much for helping to put this on. We're really excited about this event. I know there's a ton of questions about student debt. We'll talk a little bit about repayment as well. So lots of big topics to discuss. I want to get us a little bit of housekeeping underway and then we'll get started. So thanks for joining. If you have questions throughout the session, please feel free to put those in the Q&A versus the chat. By putting them in the Q&A, you all can upvote questions. That way our team knows which ones are the most kind of prominent questions and focus on getting those answered live, as well as you can ask questions anonymously there. And then for the chat, we'll kind of keep that open throughout the session. If Dr. Bartels has a, question that he wants some feedback on, he might ask you to drop that in the chat. But also for any like technical issues or things like that, feel free to use the chat. We can help work through those. So I do know that we have some VBMA business certificate program credit offered for this webinar as well. Tyler, I don't know if you want to unmute and walk everyone through how to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey guys, hope everyone's having a great night so far. So kind of going over how we're gonna for awarding BCP credit for tonight. Of course, your attendance here is huge. But it's two primary things to receive BCP credit tonight, and we're considering this as a category C. Students will have to take a short quiz, pass it with an 80%. Again, I'll put that at the end of today's webinar. And then additional to that, please register on my VBMA as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right. And then Aiden, I would say thanks so much for joining from the National SAVMA team. Not sure if you have anything that you wanted to share. I know you were just able to pop on, but mostly just thanks for helping us to co-host this event.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I'm Aiden Friesen. I'm the National SAVMA VEO. Just my apologies, having some technical difficulties getting joined, but so thank you.
Technical issues are my summary of the year 2026, so don't even worry about it. I think I am a technical issue at this point. It sounds great. Well, with that, we've gone through. Keep the questions to the Q&A, please. Try and do that as much as possible. We'll be able to ask some of those questions throughout the presentation. With that, I would say, Dr. Bartels, are you ready to hand it over to you and get started on this one?
Yeah, let me see. Are we seeing my screen now?
That looks good.
Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you. Thanks for the intros and thanks for everybody for joining. And thank you to everybody who submitted that quick student debt and income signalment form homework, and especially to those of you who shared some of your financial aid award information. That is super helpful. It really makes a difference in terms of helping us understand how your financial aid awards translate into this wonderful new world of borrowing and repayment that we're all entering into, and develop these educational tools that we have through VIN and VIN Foundation to help you all navigate this a little bit easier. And that's what this is all about, right? This is a pretty big transition, moving from a system that was kind of quirky and weird before to something that's even going to be weirder and more quirkier, right? And you all are right in the middle of it because you're attending school or soon will be during the middle of these changes. So change is never fun. Student loans are already confusing and complicated enough without adding something like this on top of it, but we're going to try to do our best to guide you through. I know there's a lot of questions. And you guys all have a lot of different circumstances, pathways. So just a couple of ground rules here. Generally speaking, when I kind of look at student debt and how it impacts veterinary students, the first thing I think of is kind of our traditional 4-year programs, right? And we even have way more permutations than we've ever had before in terms of how schools are structured and when you start and when you finish. And really, all of these changes kind of come down to the dates that they take effect, the dates that you're borrowing, the dates that you're in school. So if it doesn't seem like I'm touching on one of those I don't know, outside the traditional calendar norms for your situation, then please ask, right? So, I mean, we've got the Lincoln Memorials now that have different start dates. You know, the UAZ students have different end dates. I mean, there's just so many different permutations now that, you know, I really encourage you to kind of speak up. And if it doesn't sound like what we're talking about fits with your particular scenario, this is a perfect opportunity to try to get those types of questions answered. Because again, today's a lot about dates. And as much as I hate calendars, and I'll talk about that later, we're really going to have to get familiar with the dates, not only the dates that the changes take effect, but all of those other dates that land in your lap, depending on when you started borrowing, when you start borrowing, and the school that you attend and how they distribute loans. So all of that is going to be very important as we work our way through the presentation tonight. All right, so this was a question that somebody submitted. I thought this kind of summed it up really well. I don't know how the big, beautiful bill impacts me since I have already been a student for 1.5 years. I mean, you're in the right place, right? This is really what we're going to focus on tonight. Those of you that are in school, particularly, how do these changes impact you? And then try to navigate that. And then I know some of you might be starting school soon, so we'll touch on some of those as well. And I did see some of you that I've already graduated that registered for the session tonight too. We're not going to talk a lot about repayment. We got another session coming up in a month that deals specifically with repayment, specifically for the class of 2026. So I'm not going to talk a lot about kind of, you know, beyond those of you that have graduated much before 2026 this evening. All right, so what's changing? When are those changes happening, and who are they going to impact? So first poll tonight, I'm going to launch this here. When are you graduating from veterinary school? Hopefully you guys are seeing that. Are you guys not seeing that? And I just added these literally right before we were starting. So I see some people contributing now. So. All right, very cool. Thanks for answering that. I'll show you what that looks like here. All right, cool. Here is what I'm seeing on my end, right? So kind of like we saw in the registration, you know, but I always want to take a sanity check on who shows up versus who registered. You know, this is kind of that cohort that we're really focusing on with the Borrow Better content tonight. This is an interesting group, right? This 2030, beyond 2030, it really depends. I mean, when you started, maybe you already started. I'm just, you know, so some of that, if you have questions specifically, those are the folks that we're really going to need to chime in terms of, have you started? Did you receive a loan yet? Or, you know, where are you in that time frame? All right, very cool. So here's what we're going to try to accomplish tonight, right? So how to secure your status, right? So there are ways for you to remain under the old, what we'll call the old borrowing rules, the legacy borrowing rules, some of you refer to as grandfathering, whatever the term is that describes being able to borrow under the rules that existed before the big beautiful bill was passed on July 1st of 2025, and will change borrowing starting on July 1st of 2026. So there are some ways for you to do that. We just need to know a little bit about your borrowing history and whether or not you're willing and able to take a student loan out before July 1st to secure that status under the previous rules. And if you're not eligible for the old borrowing rules and you are subject to the new rules that do have limits on the amounts of federal student loans that you can borrow, we'll talk about what those limits are, but then you may need to explore private student loans. And there's also some other cases that you may want to explore private student loans as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about private student loans tonight. and what to watch out for if you have to go that route, because private student loans are very different from federal student loans. And that's really the biggest part of this transition, is that these loans are not the same. And, it can be difficult to manage both of them together after you graduate, and not to mention borrowing while you're in school. And then there'll be some repayment changes that we have to talk about as well. We're not going to spend a lot of time in the nitty-gritty of what repayment looks like. Really, this is about borrowing and then talking about how it might impact the options you have for repayment. But we're not going to spend a ton of time diving into the details of repayment tonight, right? Those are different webinars that we do. So these are some of those questions that I think, we're going to focus on. This one, being able to stay in school. Yeah, right. I mean, if you get limited out of the federal student loans, it can be challenging to make sure that you find that additional funding somehow, right? If that happens to be private loans, then you're going to be subject to a whole different kind of scrutiny that you haven't really had to be subject to before when it comes to student loans anyway. But the good news is, if you're a class of 2029 student, there is a way for you to get, quote, grandfathered under the prior rules. So hopefully you wouldn't have to worry about getting limited out for those federal student loans. This one has to do with the limits, right? So will I be able to borrow for my last year if I have over $200,000 already? Absolutely, right? Because if you already have $200,000, that presumes that you borrowed under the existing rules, the old rules. You'll be able to finish your program using the same rules that you were already accustomed to borrowing under. All right, so that's the good news, right? While they are changing things quite radically, there is a phase out period, or an on-ramp, if you will, where people that are already in school and borrowing for their programs still have some amount of time to continue borrowing under those rules, those previous rules. So the rug isn't being pulled out from you entirely. Now, if you haven't started borrowing yet at all, it's a little bit different story, right? And we're going to dive into some of those differences. And that's really what about this July 1st, 2026 phase out question is about, and then losing access to those Grad Plus loans. But again, that's only if you are subject to those new rules. Part of those new rules being the Grad Plus loan access is going away for those folks that are subject to those new borrowing rules. Then we have to touch upon the repayment aspects, right? So depending on when you're done borrowing, that will determine which suite of repayment options you have available after you graduate, right? So a lot to cover, and that hopefully helps to clarify why we're really going to focus in on the borrowing tonight, because we got a lot to cover just in that aspect, even before we touch on some of the differences in the repayment options that will be available. All right, so why do I do this? Because I've got a ton of student debt myself. I'm married to a veterinarian who also has a ton of student debt, and we have been through a lot of the federal student loan repayment system. Pretty much every option that has been available, we have either tried or been a part of in some way, right? So we've seen the system change. It's currently going through its probably biggest changes that I've seen in the almost 15 years of doing this. But it's also to illustrate that it changes, right? And you guys are seeing a change here. It'll probably change again, right? I mean, we haven't really gone any significant length of time since the pandemic where there hasn't been some major change or attempt to change the federal student loan system. And I don't think this last attempt or this last change that we saw through the One Big Beautiful Bill is going to be it, right? I mean, the chances are student loan borrowing repayment is going to change. It's just kind of a reality of where we are right now, and we're going to have to analyze those changes, see how they impact us, and then ultimately choose the repayment option that works best for us. Combined, we have more than $400,000 of student debt. We had tinkered with or thought about trying the standard 10-year plan, the plan that was the default repayment option for those folks who graduated and entered repayment. But for us, it was going to be more than we were earning. So it really wasn't a viable option. Stumble upon these income-driven options. So as the name implies, your payment is determined by your income. We started with one of the earlier versions called income-based repayment, or IBR. in the midst of repayment, they created a new repayment option called Revised Pay As You Earn. Then Revised Pay As You Earn was converted to Save, right? And then Save ended up kind of attracting a little bit too much court attention. And now we're in a forbearance because the court blocked the administration of that particular plan. So this is what student loan repayment can look like, right? For many of you, it will probably be much simpler because you won't have nearly the number of options available. So in some aspects, that's a good thing, but in other aspects, it's not a good thing because you're kind of stuck with what's available, right? So there are some good aspects of the options that you're going to have available. So that is good news. You're just not going to have a menu of options to choose from, at least, you know, based on what the new rules look like. From our circumstance, our entire student loan balance fell into the federal student loan system. That does make it easier, right? The more of your student loan balance is in the federal system, the easier, quote, easier it is to manage that debt, right? When you start having to layer on multiple types of loans on top of your federal student loans, managing it and repayment becomes much more challenging. So if you have the option of keeping all or most of your student debt in the federal system, that will make things easier when you get to repayment. And it opens the door to some of these income-driven repayment options that do remain. The income-driven plans can end in forgiveness. There are two types of forgiveness. There's either the type of forgiveness you earn through making payments for a specified period of time and then hitting a maximum repayment period. For us, that's probably around 25 years. For you all, that might be 30 years. But you can also hit forgiveness under public service loan forgiveness, which is a tax-free version of forgiveness if you meet qualifying payment requirements over 10 years of payments. So for us, we are likely on that 25-year track, you know, depending on which tracking system we believe. My wife might be a little bit closer to forgiveness than I am. Those are things that still need to play out in the system yet. But we are planning as if we will have to pay a tax when we reach forgiveness at the 25-year repayment mark, right? So that's what repayment looks like for us. I mean, it kind of got shooken up a bit when the pandemic forbearance came along. And then I just mentioned that our loans are in the SAVE forbearance now. Not really sure what's going to happen. It looks like that SAVE forbearance is going to end sometime in the not so distant future. A court just approved a settlement to pave the way to formally remove that as a repayment option. So those of us that are in that SAVE forbearance will likely be looking at a different repayment option soon. And it could be that new one that is coming online July 1st with a lot of other changes. It's called the Repayment Assistance Plan, or RAP, and we'll talk about that when we get to the borrowing aspect. But chances are borrowing and repayment is going to look a little bit different for you. Hopefully not as much changing going on over the course of time, but who knows? I mean, if history is any measure of what is likely to happen in the future, it's probably going to change again as well. So how do you deal with these changes? We do what we call a student loan physical exam, right? So just like we do with our patients, we can get our hands on our student loans, so to speak, look at the details of the loans that we've borrowed, see what kind of repayment options they have available to them, see what changes they might be subject to as we go through this transition phase. But all of that's going to be determined based on what we find on that student loan physical exam. So some of these terms should be familiar to you if you're using the federal student loan system. So direct unsubsidized loans, direct grad plus loans, those are the primary loan types that you'll have for a veterinary school education. Some of you might have direct subsidized loans from undergrad. If you're a career changer and you had a bunch of time in between undergrad or whatever you did last until now, and you're borrowing again, you may even still see some of these old federal family education loans floating around. These were the precursor to the direct loan system. Perkins loans I still see floating around out there. Less frequently, that program was discontinued in 2018, but I still do see them lingering around. And then the other big loan types we see for veterinarians and veterinary students is health profession student loans and loans for disadvantaged students. Right, so these are not all the schools provide these, but some of the schools offer these loans, and it's great when you can get those because they are a type of federal student loan. Private loans are going to be anything that doesn't fall into these categories, right? So private loans typically have a bank name associated with them, so Bank of America, Discover, Wells Fargo, Sallie Mae, all of those types of loans are in the private loan system. And there's going to be a whole bunch new players come online here now that, private loans are going to fill the gap that many borrowers aren't able to cover when they borrow for something like a veterinary school education if they are subject to the new borrowing limits.
Dr. Bartels, we've got a question here. I think it's I'm going to make it a two-part. The question is, what is the new plan? I'm completely oblivious to what the new versus old plan is. But I think even, when we're talking about these borrowing changes, maybe we could just sort of get a high-level overview of where we are, where we're headed, especially considering we've got some great participation here from VBMA and SAVMA and, the leaders in the profession looking ahead at who's starting this fall.
Yeah, so the old, when you say the old plan, like the old, I'm not sure that I follow the question. Can you say that one more time?
It says, what is the new plan? I am completely oblivious to what the new versus old plan
Yeah,
is. But
so we'll talk about the repayment options a little bit later, right? So but the new plan is called the repayment assistance plan. It's not even available yet, right? It's supposed to come online by July 1st of 2026, which is also the same time when a lot of these borrowing changes are coming online. So that new plan called RAP is not even here yet, right? So it's still like the details are still being worked out, but we will talk about that a little bit later towards the end of the session when we get to the repayment aspect of it. And I'm seeing here that these polls that I added quickly towards the end are Zoom. I love Zoom. So I'm sorry for that, but it looks like they all fired when I launched the last one. So this next poll that I added that it looks like many of you already answered was, do you currently have a federal direct loan that you received during your veterinary school program? And what I see here for poll 2 answers, and I'll try to keep that limited in that view there, is most of you said yes, right? And that's great, right? Because if you already have a federal student loan, then you can continue to borrow under the previous rules, the same rules that you borrowed under for those direct loans for the next 3 years or until you finish veterinary school, right? That's where we're headed next in these changes, right? So if you are already enrolled in school and received a direct loan, then you can keep borrowing under the same rules, the direct unsubsidized loans plus the direct grad plus loans up to the cost of attendance. So you shouldn't need any private student loans. This is where we're going to get into the calendar aspect of all of this, right? So, did you receive a loan? Great. And then the next couple of questions are going to be about, did you take your first loan after July 1st? Or will you particularly have another, I'm sorry, will you take your first loan after July 1st is another question that looks like some of you already answered. And most of you said no. And then another direct loan question about receiving another one after July 1st. And we'll kind of go through all of that here. Sorry. The poll thing kind of caught me off guard there. So calendar phobia is also known as chronophobia. I am a chronic sufferer of this. When I was poking around to find out what the name of that was, I found this. Do any of you suffer from that? That is a real word. Do any of you suffer from that? And if so, can you tell us what that is? In the chat. Have any of you seen that before? That is, so I'm guessing here, according to the Google, 70% of people suffer from this, and it is a fear of Friday the 13th. So I had no idea that that was such a thing, but there is a phobia for everything. I definitely have the chronophobia. So if you already received a direct loan for your veterinary program, you will be able to continue borrowing direct unsubsidized loans, direct Grad Plus loans up to the cost of attendance, as long as you finish your program by June 30th of 2029. Right now, if your program goes beyond that and you have to borrow loans beyond that, you'll be subject to the new limits. Right. So this is that on-ramp period that I was talking about for borrowing. Right. So if you're in school, already received a loan for your veterinary program, they'll give you another 3 years essentially to continue borrowing under the current rules. Direct unsubsidized loan, direct Grad Plus loan up to the cost of attendance. You shouldn't need any private student loans. If you're taking your first veterinary school loan, right? So I'm going to come back to the polls here. If you're taking your first veterinary school loan, poll 3, after July 1st of 2026, right, then you will be subject to the new limits. Right? So most of you not, right? A few of you, yes. Right? So if you are going to take your first veterinary school loan, either whether you have not started officially yet, or even if you are in veterinary school now and haven't had to use a direct loan yet, if you take your first one after July 1st, then you will be subject to the new limits. And the new limits are direct unsubsidized loans up to $50,000 per year with a $200,000 program total and no access to the direct Grad Plus loans. This also means that if you're in school and you have just been able to not use direct loans so far, you may want to use one if you think you're going to need more than $50,000 per year to get through the rest of school. Right? So that was another common question I saw in the registration information is, how can I potentially use the new limits to my advantage? Or what happens if I have to borrow under the new limits? Well, if you can get away with only needing $50,000 to each year to finish your program, then you don't have to worry about the new limits, right? You'll be fine, right? But if you do need more than $50,000 per year, right? So if you're attending a private school, you're there as a non-resident for most schools, and you're going to be subject to the new limits, then you're probably going to end up exceeding or needing more than that $50,000 annual limit. If you can borrow a direct loan for your veterinary program before July 1st, then you will be not subject to these limits. Right? So this is where that date stuff matters. So let's say you're maybe you received a scholarship or you had some personal funding that covered most or nearly all of your costs for the first year. Right? And now you're a second year student. Right? And you used direct loans for your second year. You're already good. Right? But maybe you've not had to take one yet. You can still choose to take one. You can still fill out a FAFSA even now, right? And accept the loan before July 1st. And as long as you accept the loan, a direct unsubsidized loan at least, you will have access to the prior student loan limits through that June 30th, 2029 date. Right? Or if you finish your program sooner, then that June 30th, 2029 date is not relevant. So $50,000 annual, $200,000 program total if you are subject to the new limits and no access to those Grad Plus loans.
My favorite question in the chat here, because we get this one quite often. Does it matter how much you take for that loan prior to July 1?
Yeah, it does not. So there's no specificity on that. It just says if you are enrolled in a program and have borrowed for that program using the direct loan program, you will be, you will maintain access to those prior limits for up to 3 years, right? Or if you finish the program sooner than that, then you're done, right? So you get that transition period to take advantage of the old rules as long as you have already received a direct loan for your veterinary school program of study.
And is that $50,000 annual guaranteed, or are there any exclusions, possibilities of not being approved up to that amount?
Yeah, so it is subject to your FAFSA, right? So when you fill out FAFSA as a veterinary student, you are filling it out independent from your family, right? So unless you have a significant amount of assets, or if you're married and your spouse has a significant amount of assets or earns a significant income, you should receive up to the $50,000 no problem.
And
But
what about,
you'll
oh,
find
sorry.
that out when you fill out the FAFSA, right? So that's what the student aid index. I'm sure you guys have seen that. I saw that in some of your FAFSAs that you submitted. So your financial aid awards that you submitted as part of your homework. Nearly everyone who's a single person in vet school has a student aid index of 0 or even a -1. And that means that you're eligible for the maximum amount. So previously, the maximum amount was the cost of attendance. So it was the tuition fees and the living expenses that the school estimated for you. You could borrow up to that amount using direct unsubsidized loans and Grad Plus loans. You can still do that if you already have a direct loan, but the people that are subject to the new rules, you can borrow up to the cost of attendance at a maximum of $50,000. The majority of veterinary school cost of attendances are beyond that $50,000. Right. So if you needed to borrow the full cost of attendance because your FAFSA said you were eligible for the full cost of attendance, if you hit the $50,000 limit, you would then need to find those additional funds elsewhere, right? Either through grants, scholarships, personal funding, or private loans. Right. So that's what the algorithm is starting to look like.
And when we're talking about that, we're talking about those that are starting to borrow after July 1, 2026.
Right. So only if you're taking your first veterinary school loan after July 1st of 2026.
We've
And
got a couple of questions coming in about those that are going to be grandfathered into the current rules, and what do the borrowing limits look like for that?
yeah, so the borrowing limits are unlimited for that. So and that's one of the reasons why they changed the limits, right? Because the unlimited access to federal student loans has led to some pretty significant balances. And there was no limit, right? The direct unsubsidized loans would hit a limit, mostly at 40,500 if you're attending a veterinary school inside the US for a 9-month academic year, right? But then you were able to get the funds you needed beyond that in the direct Grad Plus loan program, right? So if your cost of attendance was $100,000 under the old rules, and you were able to borrow 40,500 in the direct unsubsidized loans, you could easily get the additional, 60,000 or 59,500 you needed in the Grad Plus loans, right? That's the part that's changing and going away for the people subject to the new loan limits, right? They increase the annual amount that you can borrow into the direct unsubsidized program to $50,000, but the rest you have to find some other way, right? You don't get to satisfy that remaining amount through the Grad Plus program anymore, right? Only those people that are subject to the new limits, right? Starting your borrowing after July 1st of 2026, so just a few months from now. Right, so if you're grandfathered under the old rules, there are no limits, right? You just need to apply for the direct Grad Plus loans if you hit the direct unsubsidized limits that exist for the, if we want to call them the old limits, the legacy limits, the previous borrowing rules. All right, so if you receive a loan after July 1st, right? So if you're in the midst of school, right? If you're anybody here that is not graduating in 2026, you're probably going to receive a direct loan after July 1st of 2026. whether it's under the old rules or it's subject to the new limits. Right? If you receive any direct loan after July 1st of 2026, then you will be limited to the new repayment assistance program, right, or RAP, and a standard repayment option. And the standard repayment option will have a time frame determined by how much you borrow. So if you graduate with more than $100,000 per year, the maximum standard time frame is 25 years. Right? If you graduate with something less than $100,000, it steps down 20, 15, 10, depending on what that balance is. But for nearly every veterinarian who gets through veterinary school, they generally have $100,000 of student debt. The maximum repayment period on the standard plan is 25 years, but you will also have access to this new repayment assistance plan, or RAP. It has a 30-year maximum to reach forgiveness. Payments are forgiveness eligible. Public service loan forgiveness eligible. It also has some additional goodies baked into it that we'll talk about when we get to the repayment aspect in just a bit, right? So it's not terrible to get, and especially as a new grad, the repayment assistance plan is going to be super helpful for most new grads, no matter what you're doing, right? But the 30-year max of forgiveness, not great, right? Nobody wants to be in repayment longer. A lot of, hitting forgiveness at 30 years is quite unlikely in the early modeling that we're doing, unless you have really high student loan balances. But the benefit of RAP is going to be in those early years after you graduate. Right. So, but if you receive a loan after July 1st, these will be your two federal student loan repayment options. All right. So if I look at the question, answer 4, do you receive direct loan after July 1st? 2026, the majority of you said yes, right? Some of you said no. I don't know yet, right? So that's the group that's kind of intriguing there, right? So some of the questions that have come up before around this is, what if I'm, a third-year student and I want to try to forego federal student loans and maybe just use private student loans so I can maintain access to the older repayment options, right? Should I do that? Right. And that really is going to depend upon your circumstances and how much you would need to borrow. Right. But that is something that is on the table, if you will. But I would highly encourage you to kind of reach out to us so we can talk about that individually with you on the message boards, because there's some risk associated with that as well. Right. So private student loans are not as beneficial as your federal student loans. So it's not a slam dunk that you would forego federal student loans just to maintain access to the prior repayment options. That in some instances are a little bit better, but in other instances not, right? So it really depends upon your circumstances. Any other questions on the calendar confusion here? And once again, I'm really sorry about the polls and how that turned out. Was a total bummer. I didn't mean for
It
those
does
to
look
all.
like we have some gunners in our class here. So a couple of questions coming in from those that are the class of 2030 and will be starting school after July 1st. Any ability to take loans prior to that July 1st date? Anyway, if I'm starting school in August of 2026, that I can be eligible to be grandfathered into the current borrowing rules.
Yeah, it's a great question, but unfortunately, no. Unless you're going to the new LMU program in Florida or Mississippi State, those are the only two programs that are starting school this summer before July 1st. And there's no other way for you to get a loan for vet school until vet school starts. So most of the veterinary school programs start after July 1st. So no, you will be subject to the new borrowing limits.
And then on the other end of the calendar, there's some questions about current students who will have their program continue on beyond July of 2029. So looking at like a December 2029 graduation date and what this will look like for them. I'm not sure if maybe you're planning to jump to that later.
No, thank you for bringing that up. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So I saw some of those in the homework submissions. I saw some of you that had 2030 graduation dates, or 2030 graduation or December 2029 graduation, it really depends upon whether or not you'll receive a loan after June 30th, right? So it kind of depends upon how your curriculum is structured and how the school distributes the loans. You could very well receive a loan, the summer of 2029. And as long as it covers you through the end of the year, then you're still good for the old program. And, the way that the federal student loan system works is that, your school kind of determines when you receive the first distribution of a loan. And if the beginning of the semester is in the summer of 2029 and the first disbursement is before July 1st, you should still receive all of those subsequent disbursements under the old rules. But we're a little bit far away out from knowing if that's going to be the case or not. That's my guess as how it will happen. But it really depends on, if you're graduating in December 2029 and you receive a loan in the summer of 2029, how is that distribution schedule set up? And, if you are going to receive another loan in that fall or, before you graduate in December, will it be subject to the new rules or the old rules? It's just kind of too soon to tell. The good news is, at worst case scenario, it would be one semester probably, right, under the new borrowing rules. So hopefully that would be okay, right? But that one is a TBD, right? But it's a good question, and it's one I think you should ask your school that you're attending that has that graduation date and see what they think about that. But my guess is it's probably a little bit too soon for them to tell as well. If it extends beyond 2030, right, chances are you're going to be borrowing in 2030, right? And if you do have to receive a loan, like maybe you're in a 5-year program or some kind of combined program, depending on how they cut those up, you could very well end up needing to borrow under the new limits by the time you finish that program.
There was an earlier question about, as a current international vet student in the UK, would I still be grandfathered into the current terms, which I think kind of comes back to what you were just saying there about those potentially longer programs.
Yeah, exactly. It really depends on, when are you going to finish that program and how does that align with the loan distribution calendar, right? And it could be because, again, they only give you this 3-year extension essentially, right? So if you're just starting that 5-year program, right, your access to the old borrowing limits ends once you have a new disbursement, a new award after this June 30th, 2029 date. So you could very well end up needing to, you'll be subject to those new borrowing limits for that maybe last year or two of your program, depending on where you are in that schedule. This is why I hate calendars, right? It's kind of a mind bender to try to figure that stuff out, particularly on how the student loan distribution calendar works. But yeah, and then there's also we still don't really know. Those of you that are international students already know this, but the limits for direct unsubsidized loans are lower, right? Or under the old rules, right? So instead of the 40,500, yours is 20,500 in the direct unsubsidized loan. So you end up with more of your loans in the Grad Plus loan category just because that program is outside of the US. We haven't seen any indication that they're going to do anything similar for the new limits. But another thing that kind of is TBD, right? So something to keep an eye on when it comes to those new limits, particularly for those US US student loan eligible students that are attending international programs. Any other questions on the borrowing and the calendar?
There's some questions here about navigating, am I a current borrower? So there's a question here about, do you have to have taken out a direct unsubsidized loan and Grad Plus loan before July 1, 2026 to qualify for the Grad Plus loans in the future? Or are you good if you just have a direct unsubsidized loan and will be able to access those Grad Plus loans if needed in the future?
Yeah, you only need a direct loan. And here, this is a perfect segue. I'll show you how to answer that question, right? So if you're not sure or of the details that you have, head over to studentaid.gov. Now, most of you who submitted that homework form had already figured this out, but in case you're not sure, I'll show you how to do this, right? So you'll go into studentaid.gov, and I'm going to log in here and show you guys my student loan balance. After it sends me my secure code. And don't worry, this thing changes every time you log in. So sometimes people freak out that I'm showing my password. But if you really want to go into my student loan account, please do. Pay it off if you wouldn't mind. All right. So when you're in here, right? So here's my total remaining student loan balance. I'm going to hit this view my loans. And on this page, there's a link that says download my aid data. Right. So I'm going to click that button and it's going to give me some scary language. I want this text file, right? I want to keep this text file in this TXT format. I'm going to save it to my computer. It defaults to my student aid. That's cool, right? So I'm going to save that student aid file. And then I'm going to come over to the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool, right? So this is one of the free tools that you all have access through to. It does require you to log in. You guys all have free access to VIN as veterinary students as well. But logging in allows you to kind of keep these files in here and also provide you access to the student debt message board area that I mentioned previously, but I'll show you that too. But you're going to take that student aid file and you're going to upload it. In this case, if you're still borrowing, right, you're not done borrowing yet, you're going to upload it using this middle box. And I've got some that I set up here beforehand. So this is a 2027 student, one of you that submitted your homework here. So an in-state resident has a current balance of 202, some interest that accrued. Here's the total. Here's the average interest rate, right? If I hit this show details, I'm going to see all of the loans I borrowed. So I'm going to sort this by the most recent date, right? And I can see that these are loans, direct loans from veterinary school, right? Because you're enrolled in veterinary school here. Right. So this satisfies that requirement. In this case, this person has both unsubsidized and Grad Plus loans. Right. So you check both the boxes, but you don't have to have both. Right. It just says direct loan. It doesn't say which type. You just need a loan under the direct loan system while you're enrolled in veterinary school, the current program you're in, to be, quote, grandfathered under those prior rules. Right. So when you fill out FAFSA, everything should look the same as it did when you applied for these loans previously. Right. And that will be the case through June 30th, 2029, or until you graduate. In this case, this person's scheduled to graduate in 2027, so they don't have to worry about the 2029 deadline. All right. So you can upload your student aid data file and you can look to see, when did I receive my most recent loan? What types of loans do I have, right? Direct unsubsidized, direct Grad Plus, right? Those are the ones that we care about, particularly the ones that you've received during your veterinary program. And then the in-school loan estimator will help you estimate what your graduation balance will be at the end. And that's going to depend, right? If I'm all federal student loans, it's a little bit easier, right? I know it's a little bit easier to calculate. If I end up with a combination of federal student loans and private student loans, we do have a way for you to accommodate that too, but it gets a lot more complicated. We have to make a lot more assumptions about what those private loans look like and how much they're going to accrue interest and interest rates and things like that. Right. So speaking of student loan interest, let's talk about student loan interest for a minute here. So your interest rates on your federal student loans, right, for this current academic year, 7.94. If you end up in the Grad Plus category, it's 8.94. Right. So those interest rates are fixed for the life of that loan. right? So you don't have to worry about those changing. These rates will get updated for the 2026-2027 academic year, and we're about 2 months away from that happening, right? So that's what will set that interest rate for the life of that loan that you receive for that 2026-2027 academic year, right? And this was another one of my poll questions that some of you found and already answered. So do you think your student loan interest rates will be higher, lower, or the same? The majority of you said higher. Some of you said lower. Some of you said the same. So again, we're a couple of months from seeing what that is, right? But if they were set today, or actually yesterday, they're based on the rates of the 10-year Treasury. My little cheat sheet here says it would be around 7.86% or 8.86% under the Grad Plus rate. So lower is the answer right now. Right now, we do have a couple of months, and the 10-year Treasury, unfortunately, has been a little volatile lately because of all the things going on in the world. So that could change, but chances are they're going to either be a little bit lower or probably the same as what you borrowed the previous year for the direct unsubsidized and Grad Plus loans. These are those direct unsubsidized interest caps, that the current caps, right? So the old rules, legacy rules, the ones that most of you are currently borrowing under. If for a 9-month academic year, 40,500, when you get the clinical year at most schools or whenever your clinical year is, that covers that 12-month calendar period, then the maximum is 47,167. Right, so that's what sets the maximums currently for the direct unsubsidized loan, and then anything you need above that falls into that Grad Plus category. And if you attend a school outside the U.S., these limits are lower, right? It's that 20,500 is the limit. You don't get the additional amounts that the U.S. students get attending a program inside the U.S. All right, chat poll. So these are just comments in the chat, right? What are some pros and cons of paying interest during school? And ultimately, do you think it's a good idea to pay the interest on your student loans while you're in school? So give me some thoughts on that in the chat, or if you're doing that, what have you seen in terms of making those payments?
While everyone takes a moment to get some answers in the chat there, for programs that divide loans into different disbursements for each semester, can you request a single early disbursement instead?
No, so the way that the disbursement schedule normally works, right? So for a 9-month, for a 9, 10, and sometimes even 11-month year, you will get the disbursements cut in half, right? So you'll get half of your award in the fall for a traditional program, you get the other half in the spring, right? So most of you, if we're talking about a traditional August start date, you got half of your financial aid award in August. You got the other half here in January when you started your spring semester, right? That's normally how it works. On the 12-month schedule, that's when it gets a little bit different, right? So sometimes they'll divide it up. They'll give you a disbursement in the summer too, right? And depending on the school and how they choose to do it, sometimes you get like 30% in the summer, and then you'll get another chunk in the fall, and then another chunk, the remaining chunk again in the spring. So only that 12-month calendar year is the one that sometimes you'll see a 3 disbursement schedule, but there is no way to allow them to send you the full amount in one shot, right? They will always divide it. It's just a matter of whether they divide it in half or they divide it in some kind of thirds, depending on the length of that particular semester.
And then real quick before we get back to our chat poll there, just going back to the idea of which types of loans need to be taken before July 1 in order to be grandfathered into the current rules. There's some comments here in the Q&A that are sharing that their school told them that they had to take out a Grad Plus loan specifically and even by certain dates in order to be grandfathered into the current rules. Can you just comment on that real quick?
Sure. No, I think that's fair. It's change is messy, right? We've all been trying to figure this out, right? And unfortunately, you know, there hasn't been a lot of detail provided. And the law just is really kind of silent. It just says that if you have borrowed under the current program for your existing program of study, then you will have another up to a maximum of 3 years um, to maintain those previous limits. With all the laws, they go through what's called a negotiated rulemaking process, where they kind of fill in the details that the law doesn't cover. And they're still doing that for the borrowing and for the repayment. And in the draft of those rules, they did specify a direct loan, right? And the only thing they said was direct loan, right? They didn't say an amount. They didn't say it had to be a direct unsubsidized loan or a direct Grad Plus loan. The the In the early stages of this, there were a number of schools that were being very cautious and to make sure that you maintain access to a direct Grad Plus loan, they encourage you to take a Grad Plus loan. And I don't think that was wrong, right? I just think they were acting on the best information that they had at the time. And it's still, it's still not like widely available information out there. You really have to dig through some of the bowels of the government process to even pick out, where it says direct loan. Right. So that is very recent information that has just kind of come to light. So if you were previously told to take a direct Grad Plus loan, even if you didn't need one, yeah, it turns out you probably didn't need the Grad Plus loan, but it's okay, right? It still satisfies the requirement that you borrow a direct loan in order to be eligible for the prior limits, right? So yes, the direct Grad Plus loans are a little bit more expensive. They have a higher interest rate, they have higher fees, but I mean, hopefully, those of you that voluntarily took one of those didn't take a whole lot, right? So again, you check the box to make sure that you preserved access to the unlimited funds that you can use in the federal student loan system in case you need them to get through school. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? I still think that was a good idea, right? But now that we have slightly more clarity, at the 10th hour of these changes taking effect, it turns out that you only need a direct loan, right? So, if you haven't taken one yet, then you can take a direct unsubsidized loan to satisfy that requirement. If you've already got the Grad Plus loan to satisfy that requirement, I wouldn't complicate things and return it and try to take a different one. Like, just keep it, right? Keep that one on the books for when you borrow again next time after the new rules take effect, so you can be sure that you're grandfathered into those previous rules. So hopefully that sheds a little light on that. But yeah, that's been a common point of confusion for a while. All right, so coming to the chat poll. So yeah, got some good pros and cons here. The cons: cash flow safety net you have from cash is no longer there. Absolutely, right? If you do have some cash, you don't want to put yourself in a cash strapped position just to make payments on your student loans while you're still borrowing. If you have the money to pay down interest while in school, then you have the money to take smaller loans. Bingo. That's the answer, Marissa. I mean, if you can afford to make payments on your student loans, then you borrowed too much in student loans, right? So even if you budget an amount to pay towards your student loans, then instead borrow less, right? Because reducing the principal is really what you want to do. And when you make payments to loans during school, in most cases, those payments are just going directly to the interest, right? So you're not really reducing the principal. So if you want to reduce the principal, borrow less. Benjamin, I was told that if you plan on going the public service loan forgiveness route, then it is not necessary to pay interest during school. Yeah, so yes and no. I mean, I would encourage you to not pay interest during school regardless, right? Because again, if you can afford to make interest payments during school, then you probably took more student loans than you need. So borrow less, right? You'll make a bigger dent by reducing the principal, i.e. borrowing less than you would paying interest on the loans. It is true, however, if you end up reaching public service loan forgiveness, the interest that accrues during school is not really going to be very material. But that's a big if, right? I mean, I know, everybody thinks they're going to go, when we first went into veterinary school, we all thought we were going to be wildlife veterinarians, right? By the time we get out, it turns out the majority of us are companion animal practitioners in private practice and not eligible for public service loan forgiveness. Right. So while yes, public service loan forgiveness is an option, most veterinarians aren't working in a nonprofit organization, But if you do reach public service loan forgiveness, then yeah, the interest that you accrued during school is not going to be very material, right? So I would say that, yeah, that's a reason, but there are bigger reasons for not paying the interest on your loans during school. I know we should pay off the interest, but I'm not sure how. Yeah, again, I don't think you need to pay the interest off. I'm kind of trying to, what I'm driving at here is that, uh, don't worry about paying the interest while you're in school, right? If you're still borrowing, right, then you don't have the money to pay the interest on your student loans. Just borrow less if you can. And unfortunately, the way that the interest works on your student loans, you can't bypass the interest. Any payment you make to a loan, it will first get applied to interest. Once that interest is eliminated, and that interest accrues daily, right? Once that interest is eliminated, then anything above that would go directly to the principal. So it can be very difficult to hit the principal on a student loan while you're in school. There are certain exceptions to that. So if you have received a loan within 120 days, making a payment to that loan essentially returns that balance. And in that case, they remove the interest and fees that accrued during that time that equates to the amount of the payment that you made. So you're within that 120-day window now on the loans that you received in January. So if you woke up and you looked at your checking account and realized, wow, I've got more loans than I think I need, you can return that or make a payment to one of those loans that you received in a 120-day window, and that would actually undo the interest associated with it and directly hit the principal. But that's the only exception to that rule where, it's better to not make payments on your student loans. If you were to, it would be on those loans that you received within the last 120 days.
While we're on the 120 days, because I know this is a common question we've seen on the message boards recently, and it popped up in the Q&A as I was saying this. If I took a Grad Plus loan, paid it back right away, am I still going to be grandfathered into the current rules, or what does that look like?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So that one came up on the boards too. So I think that yeah, I wouldn't do that, right? So let's say you took out a Grad Plus loan and then paid it off, right? What the system is going to do is look to see if you have a loan for your current program, right? If you eliminated the balance when they go to look on July 1st, then there's a really good chance that they're going to say, oh, well, this person doesn't have any student loans for their veterinary school program. They're subject to the new limits, right? So if you want to, again, just to be safe, right? I don't know 100% if this is true or not, but if it were my dog, I would keep that balance past the July 1st date just to make sure that I can demonstrate that I have a balance for a student loan that I took for my veterinary program on July 1st, right? I think you're really playing with fire there if you try to pay it off. You took it, you paid it off, but you still think that that's going to make you eligible to be grandfathered under the old rules. I wouldn't roll those dice, right? I just think that's a bridge too far. So they're looking for ways to push people into these new limits. Don't give them one. Follow what the rules say now, which is if you've got a loan for your program, when you take another loan after July 1st, then you're going to be grandfathered under the new rules, right? So go with that interpretation. But it's a great question. Yeah, I see a question or a comment here from Talon. So Ross University in the Caribbean starts in the summertime as well. So I believe those students will be grandfathered in. I believe so. I believe there's a May start date for Ross. I think is it January, May, and September or something like that. But the May one, yes, it should, because again, you'll be taking a loan for that program before July 1st. That should enable the old borrowing rules for that 3-year on-ramp period. Very cool. All right. A couple more things on borrowing, and then we'll touch on repayment. So let's just say rules of thumb. So the federal student loans are the most flexible but really annoying debt that you're ever going to have. I know federal student debt in general stresses out veterinarians, veterinary students to the max. However, on the grand scheme of things, right, federal student loans are still the most flexible debt you are ever going to have. right? They have lots of built-in goodies in case the worst thing should happen. So think of it as coming with some really, really beneficial insurance. But it also allows you to navigate some of those early years after graduation, which can be really quite volatile for a lot of veterinarians, right? So whether you do an internship or residency, or, generally speaking, the first job that you take after veterinary school, you're not in very long, right? So you might bounce around before you find the right fit for you. It's really helpful to have access to these options that allow you to have very low or no payments for the first several years after graduation. Any other loan that you're ever going to have is not going to allow you to do that, right? So as much as it sucks to have to think about paying these student loans back, your federal student loans are still the most flexible debt that you're ever going to have. You really want to take advantage of that flexibility. And now when we look at borrowing, right, those federal student loans are still the most flexible when it comes to borrowing, particularly under the old rules compared to the new rules. Right? It's always easier to manage less than it is to manage more in repayment, right? So you do want to be cognizant, right? It's a catch-22, right? And this is one of the reasons why they changed the rules, right? It was great to give everybody, what they needed to pursue whatever line of education they wanted, but it went too far, right? There are people that are just graduating with way too high balances that are never going to be repaid. That has consequences as well. Now, the pendulum probably swung too far in one direction, right? Now we're going to put limits on them that don't really align very well with the cost of attendance. So it's going to be complicated, right? It's going to be very hard for those of you that are borrowing under those new limits to piece together the funding for particularly some of these more expensive seats. Right. So if you can, especially those of you that haven't selected a veterinary school yet, if you have a less expensive option, take it. Right. Especially if you need student loans. Right. Because piecing together federal student loans and private student loans, not only is that going to be challenging to get through veterinary school, but it's going to present more challenges when you get to paying back your student loans. Right. Because those private student loans, no private student loans are as flexible as your federal student loans. So if you do have to borrow private student loans, you really want to minimize the amount that you finish veterinary school with. Right. And this was I think my last polling question, which let me see if I can find those. Got a window here. Yeah, federal student loan interest compounds, true or false? Yeah, so the majority of you said true, right? The answer is actually false. Right, so federal student loans do not compound. This is another reason why you don't want to pay the interest while you're in school. Right, so compounding, what is compounding? Compounding is when your interest regularly gets added to your principal. That is not what happens to your federal student loans. And we see that when you upload your student aid data file, right? So we've got our principal, right? This is what generates the interest. Right? The unpaid interest is the amount of interest that has been charged to you based on the principal, but you aren't charged any additional interest on this unpaid interest. Right? And one of the nice things about your federal student loans is that if you do everything appropriate after you graduate, this unpaid interest will never get added to your principal. So you will never get charged additional interest on this unpaid interest. That's very valuable. Private student loans are not going to work that way. Private student loans may not capitalize that interest during school, but when you enter repayment, they're going to take that unpaid interest and they're going to add it to the principal. Right? Your federal student loans, there is a way for you to get this unpaid interest to stay off this principal balance, right? So you would pay that separately. Now, the downside of that is any payments that you make first go towards that unpaid interest before it can hit the principal, but it will save you money in the long run because it's not added to the principal. It doesn't accrue any additional interest. Right? And I know this is kind of mind bending, but these are some really huge benefits when we look at your federal student loans compared to other types of debt. All right, so tips and tricks.
Sorry,
Yep, go ahead.
I was gonna say before you move on, I wanted to wrap up with some of our borrowing questions, but
Yeah, sure.
if you've got this slide to go, we can do that one
Yeah,
first.
I can cover this one. So your federal student loans, again, most flexible debt. Some of the things that I do see helping, right, is when you fill out your financial aid award, most of you are going to be offered the full cost of attendance. So the full cost of attendance are tuition and fees and whatever the school allocates for living expenses. And there's a lot of stuff in there. Right now, they may not match what your living expenses are entirely. So, if you are more frugal or you have a situation where you don't necessarily need what the school thinks you need for your living expenses, you can borrow less. Health insurance, since it's become really expensive at most schools, sometimes you can get Medicaid as a student, and some of the schools do a better job than others of encouraging you to explore Medicaid as a health insurance option. I mean, that could save you, some schools are charging 7 or 8 grand a year for health insurance, right? So, I mean, multiply that by 4. I mean, that's, nearly $30,000 you could save if you are eligible for Medicaid. You may also be eligible for SNAP benefits, food assistance, right, which can help defer some of those food costs, right? So, I mean, those are things that you can, do to try to minimize the amounts that you're borrowed. It's really on that living expense side of things that you have the ability to, um, you know, manage things. Like the tuition and fees, unless you're receiving grants, scholarships regularly, it's really hard to put a dent in those sorts of expenses. We'd already talked about, try to not make those payments during school. Instead, return those funds that you received maybe in a 120-day window if you find that you borrowed more than you needed. Budget, you can't get around budgeting, right? Open a spending account, open a savings account too. When you get that amount that you're going to use to cover your living expenses, keep a little bit in the spending account to cover your immediate expenses, but transfer the rest into some interest-bearing savings account, right? So you can earn some interest on that, but it also puts a barrier between your spending account and your savings account. And then you can transfer back over the amounts you need for your major expenses, right? Your rent, your utilities, food, those sorts of things. And then check in periodically to see how that savings account's doing. You may find that, that alone will help preserve some of those funds. And if some of those funds are federal student loan funds and you're still within that 120-day window, you can consider returning some of those awards if you borrowed more than you needed. You do have that 120 days. 120 days is a long time, right? So if you received your first loan this semester in the beginning of January, you have, until the beginning of May to return those funds that you borrowed in excess of what you needed. Working over breaks is great, right? That can help really, reduce the amount that you have to borrow for your living expenses. Work study programs, you can ask your financial aid office about those too. Sometimes that can help reduce your reliance, particularly if you're one of those folks that are staring down some private student loans, right? So, anything you can do to reduce the potential need that you have for private student loans will help. We also want to make sure that you have enough money to get to your first paycheck, right? So it's one thing to be frugal and try to, get yourself down to the penny or nickel now, since we did away with pennies, of how much you actually need. But you don't want to strap yourself so thin that you're putting your expenses from graduation to your first paycheck on a credit card, right? So it's okay to build an emergency fund. If you do have some extra left over, stash it away in that savings account and keep it as a dedicated emergency fund. That might come in handy to help you navigate those moving expenses to get to your first paycheck, so you don't have to use that credit card to navigate those sorts of things. All right. Private student loans, because they're different, right? And if you do need those, so those of you that are going to start borrowing after July 1st, this is going to be a new world, right? So, new for most of you, right? Now, if you're kind of a non-traditional student, maybe you've already gone through a mortgage application process or borrowed money for a car or something like that, right? But everything is credit based and credit score based, and they're going to want to know what your credit score is. If you have no idea what your credit score is, or this is the first time you've ever heard of one, go find out, right? I mean, it's one of those things that you're just going to need to know, right? Here are some resources that you can use. Annualcreditreport.com, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has a good material on credit reports and scores. You're probably going to need a minimum to be eligible And if you don't have much credit history, you probably won't have a minimum credit score that's in this range. And that's where cosigner is going to come into play, right? So you may need a family member or some other trusted person who is credit worthy and can be a cosigner, meaning their name is also on the loan that you take. So if you can't pay it back, they're going to expect that other person to pay it back, right? So these are differences compared to what we've traditionally had to do for federal student loans in the past. One of the most interesting private loans that I have seen is this Everly C. Schwartz one. It is a zero interest rate loan for the life of the loan, and you can get up to $20,000 per year with a lifetime cap of $80,000. And according to some of the folks that have talked to the executive director of this fund, they love veterinarians and veterinary students, right? So take them up on that, right? This application is open through April 10th, right? So especially if you're one of those students who are going to be starting veterinary school this fall, or you're receiving your first loan after July 1st, this is something you may want to apply for, right? Because it can really help to, I mean, if I was going to borrow a private student loan, this would be the next closest thing to a federal student loan that you're going to get, right? So that would be the first place I would start. And then we need to go to the other private lenders, commercial lenders, to satisfy any amounts that I need beyond that. The interest rates on private student loans can be fixed like federal student loan rates, or they can be variable, right? Which means that they will change over time, right? You want to stay away from variable interest rate loans, particularly while you're in school. You don't want to, you don't want to watch that interest rate go up when you have no control over, income and being able to pay that back. Some private loans may even make you make payments during school, right? Interest only payments or some kind of minimum payment. Make sure you read that fine print very carefully. The loan term is a tough one, right? Most of you are going to want to get the lowest interest rate you possibly can. And I don't blame you, right? But to get the lowest interest rate, that probably comes with a shorter term, meaning 5, 7, 10-year repayment term. The shorter the repayment term, the higher the payment will be after you graduate. And, I already kind of talked about those first few years after you graduate can be really volatile from an income standpoint, right? You don't really want to sign yourself up for a high monthly payment on a private loan right out of the gate, right? So that means you probably want to negotiate the longest term possible for a private loan that's probably 15 years. If you get lucky or have a good cosigner, maybe you'll get a 20-year term, but those are almost certainly going to come with higher interest rates, right? So it's a trade-off, right? When I think about the type of earnings that we see for a new grad and the volatility that we see as new grads kind of navigate the veterinary profession coming out of school, I want the maximum cash flow flexibility possible. And that means I want to have the lowest minimum monthly payment possible for all of my loans, right? So for private student loans, that probably means a longer term with a slightly higher interest rate. Your federal student loans are great because your payments will be based on your income for those first several years. So whether that goes up or down, you don't have to worry about it being an undue burden, right? But your private loans are different, right? They're not based on your income. They're going to be based on the interest rate and the term length that you choose. So try to choose the longest term length that you possibly can, even if it comes with a higher interest rate. All right, so a little bit of a checklist here on those private loans. What is my interest rate? What type of rate is it? Are you going to charge me any fees? Are there any prepayment penalties? A lot of that stuff is not common, right? But it's still stuff that you have to look for. What are your repayment options, not only during school, but when you get out? What's the expected balance when repayment begins, which will then directly translate into that payment that will be due after you graduate? And then what happens if you have trouble making payments, right? This is the insurance that's already baked into your federal student loans. If something happens and you switch jobs, lose a job, have a health event, start a family, whatever, you can get your payment lowered on the federal student loans, no problem, right? The private loans, that's more difficult. right? So ask them what those deferment and forbearance provisions are, how long they are, what happens to the interest. All of those sorts of things are going to be important when you consider, is this a good deal or a bad deal? And if you do need a cosigner, some of the private lenders will let you release that cosigner once you've met some kind of threshold. So if that's something that you want to see either written in to your private loan if you have a cosigner, and then what are those thresholds that you might need to eclipse in order to release that cosigner from being responsible on your private student loan. Okay, any questions on those private student loans for those of you that think you're going to need them? Have any of you investigated private loans yet? Because that's another thing that Beck and I are going to be looking for, is some of you to send us some of these loan terms so we can not only kind of review them with you, but start to establish some good, bad, and ugly across the student community to see what are some of these offers that private lenders are going to be offering to veterinary students. Anybody have any experience with that yet? Those of you that are 2030 graduates.
I don't see anything related to private loans
All right.
yet.
Yeah, that's been a tough one to tease out. And the only so far, the only word we've received is directly from the lenders, and that's not a great place to only get the information. So fill us in on that sort of thing when you start to see those or hear um, those offers, right? I mean, basically what they're saying now is, with a cosigner, you might be able to get a 15-year loan that has an interest rate that's similar to the Grad Plus rate, right? So 8 to 9%, right? I think that sounds a little rosy. My guess is some of those might be a little higher than that, right? It's really going to depend on your credit score and who you're bringing to the table. All right. How are we looking on repayment or questions? Let's dive into that because I know we're running long on time here. So the repayment assistance plan. So for anybody who receives a loan after July 1st, your income-driven option will be the repayment assistance plan. So the monthly payment is a percentage of your income. It has a $10 minimum. So even if you had a zero income or a negative income, you would still be responsible for paying at least $10 per month. The maximum is 10% of your adjusted gross income. So the measure from your tax return. The goodies that come with it are 100% unpaid interest subsidy plus a principal credit. So what does that mean? If you accrue $1,000 per month of interest and your payment is $500 per month, the Department of Education covers that $500, right? You are not responsible for the interest that your payment doesn't cover. In addition to that, when your payment doesn't directly reduce the principal, you will receive a $50 principal reduction for every month that's the case. So while your payment is less than the interest that accrues, which can be very common for a recent graduate veterinarian for up to maybe even 3 years after they graduate, you will see your loan balance decrease by just making the minimum payment due based on your income. And that's going to be a huge benefit. And, even though you're limited to RAP, anybody who's eligible for RAP, which will include myself and, anybody that already has a direct loan, is going to probably want to look at it for those circumstances where their income is relatively low. And that happens in internship, residency, early years after graduation scenarios, or if you're doing something else within veterinary medicine that tends to have an income that's below the averages that we see, right? So RAP is going to be very useful for a huge segment of borrowers, and it's going to be a strategic gift for new graduate veterinarians in particular. Now, whether or not you reach forgiveness at 30 years, I mean, we're way too early in the game to even worry about that, right? So don't let that discourage you, right? The real benefits of RAP are in those early years after you graduate, right? So even if you're graduating in 2026, or you've already graduated, RAP is going to be very beneficial plan to get started with, particularly if the payment that's calculated based on your income would be less than the interest that accrues on your loans each month. So how do we know that? We come back to our student loan physical exam. We upload our student aid data file into the My Student Loans tool. You'll see here how much interest that you're accruing per month on your student loans. And if your monthly payment is calculated to be lower than that interest, it'll be in red like it is here, right? Then a plan like WRAP is going to be a huge benefit for you. Right. So don't overlook WRAP. I see a lot, and even some of the financial planners I've been talking to recently, they've kind of just overlooked WRAP because this administration created it and they didn't like all of the other income-driven plans before. But WRAP is got some of the best aspects of the earlier income-driven plans, with the exception of this silly 30-year forgiveness thing. Right. And yeah, I mean, I would change that if I could, but this part is hugely beneficial, particularly in the early years as you're getting started. So don't poo-poo WRAP just because it's got a long time to forgiveness, right? And those of you that think you're going to work towards public service loan forgiveness, WRAP is going to be the plan that you're going to want to use. Now, whether or not you remain in WRAP and for how long, that's all going to be determined based on how your income changes over time. Right. So maybe WRAP won't be the best long-term plan, but it's going to be the best short-term plan out of the gate for pretty much any new or recent graduate veterinarian. The standard plan, right, which is the other option that's available to someone who receives a loan after July 1st of 2026, that could be a plan that you switch to. Right. So a standard plan, the maximum timeline is 25 years if you have a balance over $100,000. It's a fixed monthly payment based on that balance, the interest rate, and the amount that would be required to eliminate that balance in that 25-year period. The problem with the standard plan, particularly if it's beyond a 10-year, which it will be for nearly every veterinarian, is you don't get forgiveness credit for it, right? So you don't really want to use it until maybe you've already exhausted all of the benefits of WRAP and it's quite clear that you're not going to hit forgiveness using a plan like WRAP. Then the standard plan might be the plan for you. Right. So those are the two options that are going to be available to anybody that has a loan after July 1st of 2026. All right, repayment questions on that. Any repayment?
Looking through here. Um, Looks like we've got some more borrowing questions coming up. There is one that I want to make sure that it gets covered about dual degree programs. So the specific question was, for dual degree programs such as a DVM, MBA, will the amount awarded caps be per person or per program? That's a messy situation, so I really want to make sure we get some dual degree information out there.
Yeah, the dual degree ones are complicated, right? And it really, I was a dual degree person. I did a DVM MBA at CSU, and I can tell you that based on the way that it was structured, so I started in the MBA program, and while they allowed me to take a couple of veterinary school classes in that first year, I wasn't technically enrolled in the veterinary program in that year one, right? I didn't technically matriculate formally into the veterinary program until year two, right? And it's going to be those kind of details that are important, right? So, and the way that the rules are set up now, if I'm doing a quote combined program on paper, that program was a master's program for the first year, in which case I have lower student loan limits compared to the professional program, which is veterinary school. And then I'm enrolled in the professional program in year two in that example. Then that's when I get access to the higher annual loan limits. Right. So it's really going to depend on how that dual degree program is structured and when you're mostly in the veterinary program compared to the other combined portion, right? Because there's different limits for the graduate school programs, which master's programs fall into, versus the professional program, which is veterinary school, right? So it's really going to depend on the details of how the enrollment works at your school.
Can you revisit what do you mean by if you won't hit forgiveness under RAP? What would disqualify you from reaching forgiveness under this plan?
Paying your balance up to zero before 30 years, right? So let's go. That's a good excuse for me to go through the repayment tools, right? So this person is graduating in 2027, right? They've borrowed, they've got a little bit maybe left to receive um, on this loan. You know what? I created a in-school loan estimation for this person. You see, this is 2027. So we would send this over to the in-school loan estimator here. I adjusted some of the input already. So we take over that information that was in the My Student Loans tool. We adjust our graduation date. They've got 1 year left to borrow. I updated the figures for this school's cost of attendance. I assumed that they were going to receive another $10,000 scholarship, which they received the previous year, and then the remaining balance fell into the direct loans for that additional year they have to borrow. So the direct unsubsidized loan, in this case, 40,500. Anything I needed above that in this case was a small amount of Grad Plus loans, about 4,300. That rounds out the borrowing. Now, the good news here, this person thought they were going to finish veterinary school with $310,000 of student debt. They might if they don't receive that scholarship award, but in this estimation, I've got them a little bit under $300,000. Right, so this is my graduation balance. So I got something that I can work with here. Right, so I'm going to send this over to the student loan repayment simulator. And this is where you can start to play with what repayment will look like for you. Right, so we bring over all of that information, the amount that you borrowed, the unpaid interest that you have during school, your average interest rate, all of that will be important. When you do get into repayment, I would encourage you to use the auto pay feature. It will knock off 0.25% from your interest rate. So I'll hit that button and apply it there, right? I will also encourage all of you, no matter where you are in school, to file a tax return before you graduate. If you have a tax return on file, you can use the adjusted gross income from that tax return as valid income documentation when you apply for that income-driven plan after you graduate. And again, it's going to be hard to find a scenario where any one of you will not benefit from RAP as you get started. Even if you have a very small amount of federal direct loan balance, RAP is still your friend. But anybody with federal direct loan should be really eyeballing RAP, particularly as they graduate and enter repayment. And if you have that tax return on file, it's probably going to show a very low or zero number on it, right? We can take that into account. So let's assume this person goes straight into private practice. The average veterinarian who graduated in 2025 was reporting earning about $140,000 as a small animal private practitioner. If they file a tax return before they graduated, right, that is probably going to show a zero from that tax return they filed immediately before graduation. They can use that to get the lowest payment possible using the repayment assistance plan, right? And then that year that you graduate, because you graduate generally speaking in May, you start your job maybe in June, July, that's half a year's worth of earning, right? So you're not going to see a full year's worth of income on a tax return as a recent grad until you file that third tax return probably after graduation. And you can use that strategically to your advantage to have a very low federal student loan payment, let the government cover the interest and pay down the principal while you boost all of your other areas of your financial wellness. Whether that's, creating an emergency fund, paying down less flexible debt, for some of you paying down private student loans, right? You've got kind of a 3-year magic window there before your federal student loan payment becomes something substantial. The way the federal student loan repayment options work, they take your family information into account too. So if you're married, it gets way more complicated. Once you start having children, it gets way more complicated. All of that will have an impact on that RAP payment. These will leave off the table for now, but once you start getting into repayment, they become more important. I'm going to run the simulation. This is just some wording. Again, RAP is kind of in a draft form, so take it with a grain of salt. This is our best interpretation of what RAP will look like as a new grad. That payment will be $10 per month at minimum. right? And over the first 2 years, you might make $4,300 of payments towards your student loans, right? But if you tried to pay them off faster, this is what that looks like, right? So you've got a huge amount of cash flow there that you can play with just in those first couple of years. And then I'm going to kind of scan down here. If I just let this simulation run for 30 years, it's going to adjust that income. In this case, I think we inflated it by 3.5% per year, right? That 140,000. Take that with a grain of salt too. Most people's income just doesn't increase on a straight line like that, but we want to get you started somehow. So if we run it for 30 years, assuming those income increases, in this particular case, this person has a very small amount forgiven, right, compared to what they started with, right? So they do technically reach forgiveness at 30 years if they were to pay the minimum for 30 years, right? They would hit forgiveness. But chances are, right, when I look at that, I mean, again, 30 years is a crazy long time from now, right? So something's going to change, right? That'll either make that more obvious that forgiveness is a good idea, or it'll make it less obvious that you're not going to hit forgiveness. So that's what I mean when I say, are you going to hit forgiveness? I run it through the simulator. Do I see you have a balance forgiven? What's the magnitude of that balance? In this case, it's not very much. So I don't put a lot of weight in the fact that this person is likely to reach forgiveness, but we've got a lot of time between now and there to make adjustments to that. Right. So that's what I mean. Now you could see, the legacy options, and we still have those in the simulator, completely different story. Right. In this case, where they might have an option to hit forgiveness of 20 years, I mean, it's quite obvious that they'll hit forgiveness of 20 years. Right. So this is the part that's completely different, right? Those folks that are already out there in repayment and have access to some of these newer options, those forgiveness pathways are a no-brainer, right? Because they're quite likely and they will save them a lot of money, right? For this particular person, RAP is going to be great strategically in their early years, but chances are we're going to not want to ride that out all the way for the 30-year period. Right, we're gonna either accelerate that payment, or we're gonna switch to another option that might extinguish that balance sooner to keep the cost at a more manageable level. Right, but all of that's going to depend on how your circumstances are unfolding after graduation. Right, but for now, you can kind of use it as a screening test. If you do have a higher balance when you graduate, then yeah, you will still hit forgiveness under RAP with a meaningful amount. In that case, I would just plan on continuing to use it until something significantly changes in your circumstances, right? But if I also, let's come up here, and if we want to look at public service loan forgiveness, if I flip the switch on that, we have here, right? And I rerun the simulation. Oops, I missed the button. Where's my simulation button? It's here. I'm going to rerun the simulation. Public service loan forgiveness is a completely different story, right? So because there's a 10-year pathway for you to reach student loan forgiveness after making 10 years of qualifying payments. Using a plan like RAP for those 10 years is hugely beneficial, right? So here we see we started with a balance a little over 300,000. I pay in total 140 of that, and 241,000 is forgiven. Well, actually more than that, nearly 300,000 is forgiven, and I don't have to pay tax on that. Right. So, for the folks that want to know what's the quickest, cheapest way to eliminate my student debt, particularly if you have a relatively high balance, public service loan forgiveness is the answer. Right. So that requires you to find employment in a nonprofit organization. Right. So, shelter, zoo, aquarium, as long as it's a 501c3, state veterinarians, working for an academic institution, all of those things are public service loan forgiveness eligible. So public service loan forgiveness is still available, still law. They even wrote in RAP as a qualifying payment for public service loan forgiveness. So, it's still there, right? And it's still very eligible. So if your career path aligns with that, or you think you want to use public service loan forgiveness to eliminate your student loans, that is a very good strategy as well. All right. Any other questions on that particular? I mean, that was kind of a long tangent. And I'm kind of going through some of these comments you all put in here about private loans, which are great. So I see some of you have been successful in getting some. SoFi told you no the last time I checked because I didn't have a credit score. Yeah, so I mean, you guys are all kind of reflecting what we have talked about. Now, some of you have been successful in finding some relatively reasonable private loan rates too. The devil's in the details there, right? I would want to know, did you have to have a cosigner and those sorts of things? But it's going to be a little harder to compare private loan offers from person to person because it's going to be so dependent upon your specific circumstances. So just because somebody told you that they got a great offer on a private student loan rate doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the same one. That's one of the insidious aspects of this change is that it's so variable, those private student loans. And the federal student loans, I mean, as crazy as they are, they're at least consistent for everybody, right? So that's going to be a pretty difficult thing to work through.
Quite a few questions coming in about penalties for paying off student loans faster, um, especially when looking at using RAP.
Yeah, so there are no you know, you're not going to get written up for it. But and this is going to be something that is going to be difficult to convey. Um, the penalty is wasting your money, right? So there's not a formal penalty, but if you make payments above the minimum, right? So in that situation, like if I go back to here and I use this as an example, if I've got $1,200 a month of interest and my payment is $700, right? I'm missing the interest by $500, right? The Department of Education is going to cover that automatically. If I choose to pay extra, I reduce the subsidy, right? So I just essentially, I'm saving the taxpayer $500 a month, which is great, but you don't need to do that, right? So don't do that. Don't do that until your minimum monthly payment is greater than the monthly interest that accrues on your student loans. And you can look at that in the simulator, right? So in this case, if I come to the monthly repayment summary tab and look at RAP, right? When the monthly loan payment in the red here exceeds the blue line, which is the monthly interest, that's when you've exhausted the benefits of RAP. And that's when making extra payments would make financial sense, right? But in this simulation, right, that's 7 years from graduation, right? And it's one of the hardest things to do lately has been trying to convince students to not try to come out guns blazing to reduce their student loan balance. But you're kind of cutting your nose off to spite your face there, right? There are better things you can do with that money that you would throw extra towards your student loans while your minimum payment is below the interest accrual. Take advantage of those things, right? Build an emergency fund, maximize your retirement funds, pay down less flexible debt, save for the down payment on a house, put it in an S&P 500 index fund, right? And by the time you get to this point, then you can cash that out and make a more aggressive payment that'll make a bigger dent in your student loans, right? But trying to force your loans to go down sooner when the government's already covering the interest for you is not a good strategy, right? You're going to just waste money and get really frustrated, right? So take advantage of those benefits while you're receiving them. But it requires you to know that you're receiving them to know when to then, accelerate that payoff later, right? So you can use these things as strategies, benefits to boost other areas of your financial wellness and still pay down your student loans faster when it makes sense to do so. But if you do it before your income requires you to do it, you're really just going to kind of penalize yourself. All right. Any questions on that, and particularly repayment? I know you guys were kind of venturing off into that the repayment woods there. Yeah, right. Well, that's true too, Victoria. I mean, there's a lot of the pandemic forbearance there are so many of us out there that, and Becca can speak to this, right? I mean, you just really haven't had to make payments to your student loans because the system's been so screwed up for so long, right? So, you don't really want to run headfirst into that, right? Pace yourself a bit. Anybody else have any questions on repayment? Right? These charts here kind of show you what various income levels will generate in a wrap monthly payment, right? So, until that monthly payment exceeds that interest, right, you really don't need to make extra payments to your federal student loans. That money will be better spent elsewhere, right? And the reason why the standard plans aren't great for student loans out of the gate is because those payments are generally higher, particularly for higher student loan balances, than they will be for the average incomes that we see for most new graduate veterinarians. Doesn't mean you won't end up there at some point. It's just not a good place to start. All right. There are definitely some slides here that we didn't get to. I'll show you this one, right? The secret to student loan repayment, right? You're going to pay your loans to zero one way or another, right? You'll either hit forgiveness or you won't, right? Either way is fine, right? Just manage your student loan payment based on your earnings, right? It's a hugely beneficial option that you have to do that. And it will allow you to focus on other areas of your financial wellness. And the sooner you start focusing on those, the longer they have to grow and flourish. And eventually they'll outgrow your student loans, right? Your student loans, because of how they work, some of the things that we talked about, not compounding, right? That unpaid interest not getting added to your principal, the unpaid interest subsidy for RAP and that principal reduction. All of those things will keep your federal student loans from growing out of control while the other areas of your financial wellness will grow on your behalf, right? But that's something that you have to decide to do intentionally. It won't happen automatically. So those are those things to try to avoid, right? Or, again, keep as much of your student loans as federal as possible. Minimize your borrowing as much as you possibly can, right? That's all relative depending on the school that you're attending and your borrowing needs. Don't sacrifice other more critical areas of your financial wellness just to pay off your student loans faster, right? It really is, kind of a self penalty, if you will. There's no formal penalty, but it just kind of adds to the hole that you'll end up digging out of later. Oh yeah. So I wanted to show you guys this too. So I'll finish up with just some things on VIN. So when you're logged into the Student Debt Center here and you upload a student aid data file, if you have questions, you want personalized assistance, there's a link to the message board here. Right. So all of you, again, have free access to VIN. You hopefully are familiar with it. I think I typed that in wrong. Let's see. Oh, I got it. Great. That's what we're doing now. So this will take you to the student debt message board area. And if I click on this title over here, you'll see it'll open up an expanded view. There are gobs and gobs of discussions in here, right? Just like there are on VIN for veterinarians helping other veterinary colleagues working through clinical cases. We have the same thing going on in the student debt message board area, right? And there are thousands of these discussions in here as well. All of this information comes from you all, cases, veterinarians, our colleagues, students who ask questions or ask for help navigating their student loans. You can see a veterinarian here that graduated, 20 years ago, that's knocking on the door of public service loan forgiveness, right? Still trying to figure out, how do I get there, right? Because the system has been in such turmoil. Like, how do I get there, right? And that's what Dr. Mears and I do. We provide that guidance for you to get to where you want to be with your student loans. Right, it starts with that student loan physical exam. We show you your repayment options that you're eligible for, and using your income and all the other information that you put in here, we craft a strategy to help you get where you want to be with your student loans. So you can post your questions in here. You can peruse all of the ones that have already been asked. Maybe you'll find one that matches your circumstances as well. But this is the assistance that we provide to veterinarians whether you're a VIN member or not. Everybody has access to VIN for free as a student after veterinary school. Even if you don't maintain your active VIN membership, you'll still have access to the student debt message board area. But we do need you to have that VIN username and password so we know that we're helping a veterinarian, right? So that you'll have access through VIN Foundation in that scenario. One of the other things that I built in here I thought was kind of interesting. One of the students recently that posted is going to be graduating in 2027, asked about paying their loans back as fast as possible. And VIN has a new AI mode feature. So I'm going to show you what that looks like here. So you can even put that in to this. So it starts with search. So essentially, if you've never been on VIN search before, this is what VIN search looks like. And if I type in paying loans as fast as possible in here, I'll get all of the native search results that are associated with that. But I can also see what the AI mode has to say about it. So the VIN AI mode, it only takes information that's within VIN, right? It doesn't pull from outside. It doesn't push anything outside, but it uses all of the data that's in VIN since the 1990s of clinicians talking to clinicians. And since we started talking about student loans, more than 10 years ago, all of that will feed into even questions about student loans in the AI mode. And I ran this one through earlier, and it does a pretty good job of high level answering this question that many veterinary students ask. What about paying my loans back as fast as possible? And it'll kind of go through basically what I just told you, right? That yeah, sure, you can do it, but make sure you consider your income, right? And other areas that you should take advantage of, right? So, give this a shot, right? If you have some questions like that, the more you talk to it, the more specific it will get. And if you have a question about what you're seeing or what pops up, you can provide feedback or post it in the message boards so we know if we need to tweak it to make it better, right? It's not really designed specifically for student debt, but from the testing I've done on basic student loan questions like that, it does a pretty good job. Like I don't hate it, right? It's like all AI, you have to take it with a grain of salt and try to and double check it. Like here it talks about save a lot, right? But the good news is, well, good and bad. Save is going away, but wrap, which is going to take its place, has a lot of the same features as save did, right? So, some of those, there is some overlap there that will apply. So, take a peek, play with it. I mean, we're just trying to get you the best information you can have when it comes to navigating this particularly challenging aspect of being a veterinarian. All right, cool. I mean, we're at the 2 hour mark here, or at least an hour 55. Any other questions, comments, before we put a bow on this one and call it an evening? Thanks for those of you that stuck it out. I know it's late, particularly on the East Coast. Questions, comments, suggestions, words of wisdom. See some thank you. You're welcome. So would we not? Oh, so I see a question here from Alexius about the tax filing. So would we not file any year before that? The only one you really need to file is the one right before graduation, right? So again, if I come back to that traditional model of veterinary school, if I graduate in May, let's use May of 2026, right? And we're in tax filing season now. So anybody that's graduating in 2026 this year should file a tax return by April 15th of 2026, which represents the 2025 tax year, right? So if you're graduating in 2026, file your tax return by April 15th of 2026 for your 2025 earnings year. That will give you the information you need for the repayment plan you'll choose after your grace period expires when you choose a repayment plan. Same thing for a 2027 grad. So when you're graduating in May 2027, file your tax return by April 15th of 2027, which will represent the 2026 tax year. Right? So kind of coming back to that calendar phobia, right? The calendar is really the key when it comes to student loans and navigating repayment.
So Tony, one thing we do want to say, Becca's laptop's about to die, so I'm just taking over for her real quick.
Yeah.
Is that we do have a VIN Foundation Rumble blanket that we will be giving out to those who registered, completed the homework, and attended this evening. So we will choose that person and reach out to you as a special bonus.
Awesome. Excellent. Yeah, that is a rainbow. It's actually a cut bow. So yeah, that's we have some of those in Colorado here.
And as everybody's been asking, we will be sending out an email within the next couple of days with the webinar recording and additional helpful information.
Yeah, well, thanks everyone. Thanks for your help. Sorry Becca's computer died. Thank you, Dr. Mears, and thank you, Jordan. Sorry again for the poll confusion there. I'll try to do a better job of that one next time. But yeah, feel free to reach out with any follow-up questions that you have, and good luck with the rest of school. And if you have any questions about borrowing, particularly those of you that are going to be subject to those new limits, please reach out, right? We're really looking, to build some database of information to help all of those folks that are going to be facing that new challenge coming forward. So don't be shy and feel free to ask questions or provide us some information on what you're finding when you're talking to those private lenders.
And as a reminder for VBMA members to receive that BCP credit, take a look at what Tyler put in the chat as well. And a big thank you to VBMA and SAVMA for collaborating on this webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you all. That was great.